Now we're going to talk about proteins, and they have an immense amount of structures that result in a wide range of functions. And while DNA is in charge mainly on recording your genetic information, proteins are involved in most of the function of your body. If you think about a function in your body, the most likely is that there is a protein involved in that. So maybe you have heard about proteins in terms of food, chicken, fish, cheese, all beans, all this for you could be proteins. Or maybe would you have heard about proteins in terms of muscles, that you have some eat some protein and you became very strong. And but here we're going to talk about proteins in terms of their molecular structure and their functions. And mainly, I want that you remember this, that they are the main work of your body. We will show you multiple functions. And you can find many more functions in your textbook. To start, I want to show you this schematic, this graphic taken from a paper. And if you see, protein is the largest portion between all the different other macromolecules like lipids, DNA, and our metabolites. And of course, another type of nucleic acid is the RNA, and proteins have a higher distribution. So proteins account for more than 50% of the dry mass of all the cells. And this in particular is a diagram from the composition of a bacteria called E. coli. And as you can see, proteins are very abundant not only in E. coli but in all living organisms because they have a lot of functions. In this class, I'm going to talk about, in the beginning, about the different functions that different proteins have. And in your textbook, you will find much more and you can see them in more detail. So go and read it. Later, I will move into the monomer of the proteins that are the amino acids. And I will show you different type of amino acids like this one. And I will show you the different type of amino acids and how they join together to form proteins. Then I will talk about the protein structure and function, and I will talk about the primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structure and what all these names mean. So let's start with the protein function. Now I'm going to talk about proteins and what are the function of proteins, and we divide it into 7 groups. And I'm sure that you can read this in more detail in your textbook. I'm just going to give you a few examples of in terms of movement. There are two very important proteins that are called actin and myosin that generally you find it in the muscles. And here you can find actin and myosin, and every time you're flexing, you're moving, actin and myosin are working together to produce this movement. And not only in the muscles, every cell in your body will have actin and myosin. And when the cells, for example, divide, actin and myosin are involved in those movements so that there is a proper cell division. And even when a cancer appears, for example, when a cell gets this property that allows them to move to another part of the body, again, actin and myosin will be involved into that. Why? Because the cancer cell, the mutation that appear in the cancer cell will activate the expression of the actin and myosin in the wrong places, in the wrong cells, and allow the cells to move to other parts of the body. So proteins are involved in function like movement, like for example actin and myosin in the muscles or in any cell or even in cancer cells, they can produce movement. Now I'm going to show you another example that is the cellular communication, and maybe you have heard about neurotransmitters. So there are many receptor proteins. When you have a neurotransmitter, that neurotransmitter has to be received by a receptor protein that is located in the membrane of another neuron, and these are very important. And we not only find this kind of receptor in neurons, even any cell of our body in the membrane will have hundreds and hundreds of receptor proteins, and we're going to study some of them, and we will study what happens when some of these receptor proteins are not working. Now, another potential function is the hormonal proteins. And in this case, we are going to talk about insulin. Maybe you have heard about that, how insulin can regulate blood in your sugar when there is an excess of blood from your pancreas. Insulin is secreted that allow your body to regulate the amount of blood in your sugar. So the function is the allow the coordination of different activities in your body. And then the example that I gave you was the insulin that is secreted in the pancreas and allow that other tissues take up glucose, and in that way regulate the blood sugar concentration. So we have talked about movement, communication, now coordination. Now I'm going to give you another example of a function of a protein, and we're going to have an entire class talking about enzymes. And enzymes have an important function that is to catalyze, to speed up reactions. So for example, you have here a disaccharide. Here you possibly have a glucose, so it's an exose carbohydrate, and here you have possibly a fructose, a pentose, yeah, and you need to digest this. So what this enzyme is doing is allowing to break this bond, and here this bond was broken, and now you have two different sugars, two monomers, separated that they can be digested much easier. So I show you that the function here of enzymes is the selective, and this is very important. You have selective acceleration of chemical reactions, and for example, digested enzymes catalyze the hydrolysis of bonds in food molecules. So here, instead of having a disaccharide, you have two monomers, an exose and a pentose. Another important function of protein is the immune response, and here you can see a diagram figure shown in your textbook that shows an antibody protein and a protein from a flu virus, and how the antibody protein inactivate the protein from the virus by attaching to it. And hopefully in the future we are also going to be able to do something like that with the coronavirus.